In 1933, Fred Bear created a legacy, pursuing his lifelong passion. Fred's mission was to ensure archery remains accessible to everyone. Here at Bear Archery, we promise to never forget the principles our brands were founded on. From the youngest archer to the oldest, we strive to build bows that give you the best shooting experience. Visit beararchery.com to discover more.
Hey everyone, this is Captain Steve Roger from Into the Blue TV. And as soon as I feel a little break from this heat, I know that hunting season is upon us. Actually, the first time I ever went hunting, a buddy took me. Wasn't my father or my grandfather. In fact, I took my father on his very first hunt. Well, Academy Sports and Outdoor Stores has everything to gear up for the field for less. Plus, you can shop a wide selection of ammo, shotguns, deer corn, rifle, feeder, game cameras, camo, and more from the brands you trust. Text HUNT24 to 22369 to take $20 off a $100 purchase when you shop hunting supplies at academy.com. Need a hunting license? Pick it up in store while you're shopping.
Welcome to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. I'm Matthew of castingacross.com, where I explore the quarry and culture of fly fishing. A little bit of a different episode today, both in format and in approach. And here's the reason why. We'll talk about the approach first. Earlier this week, we saw the really extreme and tragic effects of Hurricane Helene bearing down, yes, upon the Gulf states, but more so on southern Appalachia. And southern Appalachia is a place that is near and dear to me. And although it is certainly not the part of the country I've spent the most time in, either hiking or fishing or certainly living, I have spent time there and in a lot of areas that have abutted it. But this is a part of the country that is unique. It's special. And in a lot of ways, it's also forgotten. Now, what I don't want to do in this is paint some sort of picture that it is perfect. We're not talking about the destruction of Eden. We're talking about a truly remarkable moment where there is a natural disaster in a part of our country that, for reasons I might go into here at the end of the podcast, isn't getting the same sort of publicity that would happen if it was in a coastal area or in one of the quote-unquote elite parts of the country. But that said, it is an area that, bare minimum, a bunch of fly fishers really, really enjoy. Now, I don't want to make that the hallmark or the highlight of this podcast, because the thing that ought to be first and foremost in our minds and first and foremost in our prayers is that there has been a great loss of life. And I would imagine that as time goes on, we are only going to learn more about how many people actually have lost their life. The cities can be rebuilt, the roads can be repaved, and also, as we are talking about fly fishing, the rivers will be restored. But something that is not going to be restored is the tragedy of loss of human life. The suffering is real. The suffering is something that really should be being addressed both tangibly and in word at a much greater level than it is. But for whatever reason, it's not. But that doesn't mean that we can't be aware of this and we can't do what we can do. And as you're probably aware, given the fact that my real job is not casting across, but is a minister of the gospel, I do think prayer is a real thing that does work. If you have questions about that, let me know. Matthew at castingacross.com. But like I said, I'm going to switch up the format of the podcast a little bit today, and I'm going to share a few pieces that touch on aspects of the allure and even some of the kind of dark underbelly of this area, but how it's a place that's special, a place that's worth loving, taking care of, and certainly because of the people, it's a place that is worth really coming to aid in one way or another. So I'm going to share two of those, then I'll kind of come back at the end with a few more thoughts and comments. It looks like a movie set, Jeff said. It looks like the Soviets just pulled out, I added. It was only a halfway attempt at humor, because a few months earlier, I traveled to a former Soviet state. I spent time in some places that obviously felt the weight of a very, very difficult period in recent history. And here, in America, the condition of the buildings and infrastructure I was looking at was eerily familiar. Jeff and I took a detour through this particular town on our way to some fly fishing. The river that flowed through the town and another nearby tributary are both regional hallmarks for trout. Well-to-do anglers from a handful of metropolitan cities only a day's drive away speak highly of the watershed's beauty and challenging fish. The area around this place is a legitimate destination. I wonder how the residents of this time-worn town think about their surroundings. Like so many Appalachian hamlets, this little village was settled and developed in the mid-19th century with great hope and vigor. A burgeoning economy, one which capitalized on timber, coal, and railroads, led to establishing municipalities such as this. People came, thrived, and inevitably enjoyed the outdoor pursuits that the region afforded them. While the three aforementioned business interests almost always harmed fish populations, the decline wasn't rapid enough to eliminate it altogether during those boom years. The cumulative effects of 150 years of hard use, however, is another story for an ecosystem. Those 150 years also took their toll on the town. New technology, ecological regulations, and greater cultural shifts might have taken time to come about. Once they did, America didn't look back, even if a once bustling village was in the rear view. Sociologically speaking, there are many variables at play when it comes to rural poverty, and the equation is never identical, even up and down the same mountain range. For most of these places, there is one constant. There's a persistent trickle of angling interlopers. The diversity of rustic communities from Maine to Georgia might be wide, but our Subarus and graphite 508 rods look the same up and down the East Coast. We come for the fish and the adventure. We even bring a little bit of traffic and economic stimulus. While the people in towns like this one certainly have their fair share of struggles, so many have persevered under difficult conditions. Institutions anglers notice, such as diners, motels, and civic services, endure. Situational fragility was hardened the resolve of small communities. Fly fishers are apt to do things like anthropomorphize fish populations. Then we laud them for being resilient. Rivers that have been to the environmental brink and back produce trout with seemingly greater intrinsic value. There are success stories of creeks that were once magnificent, followed by a period of hard times, and then odds overcome. Arriving at the understanding that trout, rivers, and watersheds are part of a broader landscape helps us understand and appreciate our experience as fly fishers. Appreciating that people and towns necessarily intersect and overlap that landscape can enrich that experience. Bridges do more than provide structure for fish. Dams serve a purpose outside dictating CFS levels that facilitate dry fly action. Solitude and isolation aren't as idyllic for everyone as they are for anglers. Learning local history, spending time in a community, and having a conversation can add real depth. Depth to a fishing trip, yes, but also a depth that can impact you and others in a way that transcends trout and water. That was an article called Life Up on the Bank, Fly Fishing in Rural Appalachia. That's back from March of 2018 if you want to give that a read and think about that a little bit some more. Next is a piece from 2017, and it's got one of my favorite pictures as the header image. You should head over to castingcross.com and put in brook trout and Appalachia in the search bar, and there's just a phenomenal photograph of a decent size, incredibly dark brookie sitting on some autumn leaves just submerged under the water. I'm certainly not a great photographer, but this is some great work if I do say so myself. But this is what that article said. There's an intimacy in the Appalachian Mountains. While few segments of the topography are severe like much of the Rockies are out west, there's a tangible closeness in the hollows and valleys of eastern mountain range. Perhaps it can be attributed to the contrast that Appalachia provides. With only a short drive from Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, and Atlanta, it is hard to believe that the quiet forests are in the same states. Even the sounds of the names are simpler, calmer, and less hurried. Cumberland, Smoky, Shenandoah. Part of the intimacy of Appalachia has to do with the fact that civilization has long been here. Native Americans first, then European settlers. The game, timber, and forage all made the relatively accessible mountains a haven of sorts. The evidence of their presence, and the presence of their descendants, our ancestors, is over every ridge and behind every old oak. Clearings, charcoal pits, stone fences, Rusted stills and chimneys pepper the landscape. Once you get beyond the human element and the fact that the mountain range itself runs unbroken from Alabama to Maine, the specifics of the setting change as you traverse the Appalachians. Plants differ wildly from north to south. Birds, insects, and some mammals only exist on one side of the Mason-Dixon line or the other. If you take the time to notice, the soil smells different. But one natural component of the Appalachian Mountains that is consistent up and down the entire range is the brook trout. Even with a drastically reduced range, this little char is a fixture that anglers today can experience in the mountain hollows just like their forefathers did. Although they have been pushed to the headwaters, they thrive there. If anything, the brook trout populations today are on the mend. Simultaneously, brook trout stand out and fit right in with their landscape. Like revealing the striking visual display of a salamander or mushroom by chance, the real beauty of a brook trout has to be found and uncovered. Red spots with blue halos might be the most vivid coloration in an otherwise dense green summer forest. In the fall, orange bellies blaze brighter than the canopy above. Like the mountains themselves, or the various people who have chosen to make their home, brook trout are a constant. The wide valleys have big highways and warmed rivers that are now only suitable for high speeds and stocked rainbows. Yet up on the hillside, there are still gravel roads, tumbling creeks, and brookies. A slower approach, a shorter cast, and a more delicate gear don't just fit what is required for the angling, it fits the overall Appalachian aesthetic. But the trout, like the people, are feisty, opportunistic, and resilient. It's no surprise that they have endured acid rain and deforestation as well as they have. Long before people started mucking up their ecosystems, they dealt with floods, droughts, and wildfires. Consequently, they eat when and whatever they can. And this last point makes them a constant for anglers. You rarely have to try too hard to catch a brookie, but you always have to put forth all your effort to catch a big one. When a fat, brilliant brook trout comes to hand from a plunge pool in a gentle valley, it ties a fly fisher to that place. The fish isn't foreign like the person is, but it also stands out from the rest of the scene. Brook trout tie us to the Appalachians in a concrete way that the contrast of the ridges against the sky or the sound of the wind through the trees can't quite match. These fish, and the places they live, are intimately meaningful to so many fly fishers. Brook trout are a real substance of Appalachia that allow us to tether ourselves to a place that we love. So hopefully you appreciated those two pieces again from the archives of Casting Across. There's a lot of other stuff there about the area, about Southern Appalachia. There's articles about time in North Carolina, articles about time in South Carolina, and Tennessee as well, and certainly Southern and Southwestern Virginia. And these are places that you're not going to be doing any brook trout fishing in the immediate future. As I'll touch on here at the end of the podcast when I talk about the articles that came out this week, the fish will be okay. They always are. This is one of the amazing things about creation, is that it has been built to endure the most extreme circumstances. It's almost impossible to fathom when you see the absolute destruction, and there's really no other term that would be appropriate. These highways that look like rivers, these valleys that are flooded over the tops of their trees, and think that something could survive under that. But bugs are resilient, plants are resilient, and fish are resilient. But of course, the more important thing to think about and the more important thing to be considerate of and contemplate today is that people are resilient. But the amazing thing about people is that they're not unlike other systems. We were not created to be alone. I mean, all the way back at the beginning, one of the first things that was said to man was that it's not good for him to be alone. And that's why man was given a helper. And society is simply an outpouring of that. The family becomes the community becomes the culture becomes the world. And although there is certainly isolation when you get to places that are small and that are separated by mountains and valleys, by watersheds, there is still great connectivity in ways that you might not experience if you live somewhere where your neighbors are easily seen up and down the street and that your subdivision abuts another one all the way up into a metropolitan area and maybe to another one in the opposite direction. folks have to rely upon each other. And so ultimately, that is one of the things where you see the most endurance and resilience of areas like the Southern Appalachians. Again, not totally different from what you would find in the rest of the Appalachian mountain range, or what you would find in the valleys, or in other parts of the country that have significant rural aspects to their communities. But this is a time when places like this need help. Why it's not coming, I'm not 100% sure. I mean, I have my ideas, I have my theories, I have my political inclinations as to why this might be happening or why it might not be happening. But the fact of the matter is that this is a part of the country that is oftentimes forgotten. They are often a byword and a punchline, but they too are usually only thought of every 4 years as maybe a group that will certainly vote in one way or another, not given much more credence beyond that. And so here we have it, a time of the year where we are thinking about those things, and we are thinking about them, but also forgetting them at the same time. As I've already alluded to, I don't think it will be for a long time that we will fully appreciate the scope and the scale of not just the destruction of this area and the amount of time it takes to remediate it, but the loss of human life. And that is something that certainly transcends fly fishing. It transcends the health of a watershed, and it transcends really political machinations that may or may not be contributing to the response or lack thereof. So, what does this have to do with casting across the quarry and culture of fly fishing? Well, faithful listener, it certainly lands smack dab in the middle of the culture of fly fishing. As the first post that I read earlier intimated, you can't fish without being in a place. And for so many of us, and you may be the exception. You may be laser focused on having your boots in the water and your line out in front of you. But for the vast majority of us, a significantly appreciated aspect, a joyful component of fly fishing is driving to places that are beautiful and unique, and even beautiful in spite of the wear and tear that they have. And as I've already said, make no mistake about it, there are some rough aspects to this area that has been so hard hit by this natural disaster. We can't gloss over the economic depression. We can't gloss over the substance abuse and the abuse of drugs and alcohol. We can't gloss over the other kinds of abuse that exist there. We can't just gloss over other systemic issues that may exist. But that is also true of everywhere else in this country. It's a human problem. That's what we're talking about. But if we only went fly fishing, we only spent our entertainment dollars in places where the people were perfect, then we would have to simply put them into the incinerator because they couldn't stand to be in our own pockets, because we too are people who are not perfect. And I can say for certain that whether it be a coastal town in a relatively ritzy part of the country or in a economically depressed part of Appalachia, there is joy and goodness to be found in rubbing shoulders with people, whether it be at the bar or the diner, the fly shop or the gas station, and getting a unique touch of what makes that part of the country something unique and special. And a lot of that has been literally swept off the map for Southern Appalachia. Those accents that are unique, those gas station counter snacks that you can only buy there. They're under not just feet of water, but feet of sediment that have been washed down the hillsides. Those are the kind of things that you don't know that you have until they're gone. And they're gone. Again, much below the most significant aspect of this whole situation, which is the loss of life and human suffering. These are the kind of things that you ought to appreciate, because we ought not to go there just to appreciate the fish. We ought not to go there just to appreciate the pickled egg on the gas station counter, which I do not advocate eating, nor do I dissuade you from eating. But those things are simply the lubricant that gets you face to face with people people that are living a life that may be very similar to you in a lot of ways, but also maybe very different from you in a lot of ways. And I can say for certain that for me, Southern Appalachia is an area that is worth paying attention to. So, once more, I'm not going to be dogmatic about what you should do or shouldn't do. Bare minimum, I think you ought to be aware of this. If you are someone who prays, then I would say pray. If you feel compelled to do something to help, then do something to help. I think that's the right way to do it. Honestly, and here my political leanings are showing, I think waiting on the government to take care of it is the wrong thing to do, even if the government is ready and willing to help. I think we are stronger when we are helping each other because that's what people do, as opposed to waiting for a system to take care of it. A system that, of course, is made up of people. So, a few thoughts, a few things that I thought were worth sharing given the nature of this week, and it's been on my heart. And every once in a while, I'm going to share things that I care about here on Casting Across, both on the podcast and on the website. Questions, comments, and hey, certainly I'm open for it. Accusations, let me know. Matthew at castingacross.com. In a few weeks, the next episode of the podcast, actually coming up in 2 weeks, is going to be another edition where I do interact with your questions, comments, and feedback. But this week on castingacross.com, a few articles came out. The first one that came out was called The Trout Will Come Back, and it actually is a much shorter form of what I just talked about now, about how the fish will take care of themselves. There's bigger fish to fry, as it were. Wednesday's article is called The Science of the Flood. And here I actually provide some information. How do you know, Matt, that the trout are going to come back? Well, it's because they have in other places. I mean, places I fish here in New England, Vermont, and New Hampshire, places I fished in Virginia, or places that were completely leveled by hurricanes in the last generation. And I'm catching good numbers of brook trout in them now. And so I have faith the same thing will happen in Southern Appalachia. Again, not the most important thing, but it's kind of interesting to figure out how bugs, plants, and fish do persist even when they're faced with national disasters of extreme scope. So I definitely encourage you to check those out. This week's recommendation is a book I've mentioned before a number of times because it is an exceptional volume and one that I would say is an essential if you are an angler on the East Coast and probably if you're an angler, period. And that is Brook Trout by Nick Karras. It's on its third printing, I believe. Maybe it's fourth. I really like the cover of the second edition, which is what I have. But it is truly the definitive work on brook trout. And it talks about them in their southernmost range, like we've been talking about today, and it talks about them in other places, which at this point in history is pretty much everywhere. But whether it be the life cycle of brook trout, the biology of brook trout, the range of brook trout, the variation among that range of brook trout, and even some really interesting and important anecdotes about brook trout are all found in Brook Trout by Nick Karras. So I will put a link for that book, probably on Amazon, in the show notes for this page on the podcast show notes over at castingacross.com. Now, something else I would mention is if you want more book recommendations, then head over to the top of castingacross.com and you'll see the fly fishing library where you see this book as well as like 70 some other ones on top of it. Thanks for listening to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. Please subscribe to your favorite podcast app and rate the podcast in iTunes. Then head over to castingacross.com for 3 posts a week on the people, places, and things that go into the pursuit of fish.